Welcome back, everybody. We're back in the book of Psalms today. We're going to be in chapters 36 and 37. And I do want to say, when I started making these videos, when I started approaching the book of Psalms, I had a really high level of anxiety. Like, man, how do you read through a book like Psalms and pull some real meaning from it? But we're not even halfway through this book. And I got to tell you, God has been showing me all kinds of cool stuff about who He is, about His character, about pointing towards Jesus and the gospel. I've just been learning all kinds of good stuff from the book of Psalms, and I gotta say, I'm loving it. It's like McDonald's. I'm loving it. And I hope that my 95 billion viewers feel the same. But without further ado, 36 and 37. So here's a question to kind of jump things off. Do you ever feel like it seems like bad people always seem to be winning, and you wonder why? Like, you try to do the right thing, you try to be honest, you try to be patient, you try not to clap back at somebody who probably deserves it, but somehow it's the people who keep cutting corners that are the very same ones who seem to be thriving. They're getting ahead, they're getting the promotions, they're posting these cool vacation pictures while you're sitting here wondering if being a decent human being is even worth it. And if we're honest with today, or if we're honest with ourselves today, that is not a solely 2026 problem. That is a human problem throughout all of history. It's just a problem that humanity has struggled with. And that is exactly where chapters 36 and 37 drop us today. David is looking out at the world, seeing wickedness, seeing injustice, seeing arrogance and pride, and instead of pretending that it's not happening, he just brings it to God. He says it out loud, which I appreciate because sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is admit that, yeah, something about this feels off, something about this feels wrong. And if you've been walking through these videos with me, you know that David's life isn't exactly a calm life. This is a guy who's been hunted, he's been betrayed, he's been promoted and then demoted. Basically, he's living a life where peace is more of a suggestion than a reality. So when he talks about evil and trust and patience, he's not sitting in a Starbucks next to a scented candle reading his Bible. He is in the middle of all of these stressful situations. So let's get going. All right, so the way that David opens up Psalm 36 is not exactly super uplifting stuff. It says this in verse 1: Sin whispers to the wicked deep within their hearts. They have no fear of God at all, which is already sort of intense. He's basically saying that evil isn't just behavior, it's internal, it's persuasive, it whispers to you. And then he keeps going in verse 2. In their blind conceit, they cannot see how wicked they really are. So the issue is not people are just doing wrong. They don't even realize that they're doing wrong. They don't even realize how wrong it is. There's no awareness. There's no conviction. And if we're honest, we see this all the time. Not just this big evil movie villain type of evil, but in everyday stuff. People who justify their actions, they spin narratives around themselves. They try to convince themselves that they are right no matter what. And before we get too comfortable pointing fingers at other people who are like, yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about, I gotta tell you, it's not just them. That's me, that's you, that's us on our worst days too. But then David shifts, and this is where the psalm really breathes in verse 5. Your unfailing love, O Lord, is as vast as the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches beyond the clouds. It's like he zooms out. Yes, evil is real. Yes, people are messy, but God's love, bigger than both of those things, bigger than all of those things. Verse 6 says, Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains, your justice is like the ocean depths. You care for people and animals alike, O Lord. David is stacking up imagery here: heavens, mountains, oceans. He's trying to say, I don't even have categories big enough for how God is. And I love that contrast because the world says, look at how bad everything is around us. And David is saying, yeah, but look how big God is. And those two things exist at the very same time. Then he says in verse 7, How precious is your unfailing love, O God! All humanity finds shelter in the shadow of your wings. And I love that personal image that David is sort of painting here. It's an image of shelter, safety, like being covered up. And remember, David isn't writing this from his spa day. He's writing this as someone who needed that shelter. He needed that protection. He's running away from Saul. He's dealing with enemies. He's navigating leadership pressures. And it's not just theory. This is survival language from David. So the takeaway of Psalm chapter 36 is pretty simple, but not shallow. Evil is real, but it doesn't get the final word. God's love is bigger, God's love is deeper and more reliable than the chaos that we see around us in our everyday lives. Then David transitions into Psalm 37, where it feels like he's sitting down and he's saying, okay, here's how we actually should live in that reality. And he opens with a command that is easier to read than to actually do. Verse 1. Don't worry about the wicked or envy those who do wrong. Okay, David, that sounds great. I just simply don't have to worry anymore. Thank you so much for your advice. That helps everything. But then he explains why in verse 2. For like grass, they soon fade away, like spring flowers, they soon wither. In other words, what looks permanent isn't. Then verses 3 and 4. Trust in the Lord and do good, then you will live safely in the land and prosper. Verse 4. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desires. Now, that second verse, verse 4, that is quoted a lot, usually in a God will give you whatever you want kind of a way. But that's not what David is saying here. He's saying that when you delight in God, your desires start to change, they start to align with God's will. It's less of God, give me my wish list, and more of God reshapes what I actually want to align with his will for my life. Verse 5 says, commit everything you do to the Lord, trust him, and he will help you. Now, that word commit carries this sort of image of literally rolling something over onto somebody else. Like you're transferring the weight, you're transferring the burden onto somebody else, which sounds really good until you realize that you actually enjoy holding on to control. You want to control your problems, your fears, your anxieties, and you're like, that's my stuff. I don't want to burden somebody else with that. But then David jumps into verse 7 by saying, be still in the presence of the Lord, and wait patiently for him to act. Ah, yes, waiting. Everybody's favorite spiritual discipline. But then he continues, don't worry about evil people who prosper or fret about their wicked schemes. So again, don't obsess over what they're doing. Focus on what God is doing. And David, he keeps building this contrast throughout the chapter. Verses 12 and 13 says this, the wicked plot against the godly, and they snarl at them in defiance. But the Lord just laughs, for he sees their day of judgment coming. Now that is such a wild image. God is not stressed. God is not surprised by anything that happens in our lives. He's not surprised by world events. Meanwhile, we're over here refreshing our anxiety every 5 minutes. Then in verses 16, it says, it's better to be godly and have little than to be evil and rich. Now that cuts against everything that our culture tends to push because we usually will measure our blessing based on our visual success. But David is saying, no, our character matters more than our comfort. Then you get this verse 23. Where is it? The Lord directs the steps of the godly. He delights in every detail of their lives. Every single detail, not just the big dramatic moments, but the small details in your life matter to God too. And then verse 24 says, though they stumble, they will never fall, for the Lord holds them by the hand. That is such an encouraging, steadying image. It's not, you're never going to mess up, but it's, you won't be abandoned when you do. And then David reflects from experience in verse 25. Once I was young, and now I am old, yet I have never seen the godly abandoned or their children begging for bread. So this is David looking back over his lifetime of chaos and saying that God has been consistent through it all. He's not always been predictable. My life has not always been easy, but God has remained consistent. God has remained faithful through it all. Then he wraps things up with this final contrast in verse 20 that says, but the wicked will die. The Lord's enemies are like flowers in a field. They will disappear like smoke. So the message of Psalm 37 is basically don't panic when evil looks like it's winning. It's temporary. It's not permanent. You're encouraged to stay rooted. You're encouraged to keep trusting God. Keep on going. And this is where it all points forward. Because if we're honest, we don't just struggle with seeing evil happening out there. We wrestle with it in here too. Psalm 36 told us that sin whispers to us. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have all listened. We have all fallen short, which is why the gospel matters so much. Because Jesus doesn't just tell us to be better, he steps into our brokenness with us. And on the cross, that day that Jesus was crucified, for the people surrounding that, it had to look like evil was winning, completely winning. He had an unjust trial. He was betrayed. There was lots of violence and brutality. And if there's ever a moment where Psalm 37 felt like it was upside down, it was that very moment. And yet, that moment was where God was doing his deepest work. Through Jesus, we see that God's love and his justice meet. Sin is dealt with, not ignored. Grace is offered, not earned. So when we're told to trust God when things look wrong, we're not trusting blindly. We're trusting a God who's already proven what he does with broken situations. So what do we actually do with all of this? First, I think we need to stop measuring our lives based on somebody else's highlight reel. Psalm 37:1 tells us not to envy the wicked, which today might sound like don't compare your behind-the-scenes life to somebody else's curated life that you see on social media. It will mess up your perspective each and every time. The second thing is we need to practice transferring control over to God daily. Psalm 37:5, commit everything you do to the Lord, trust him and he will help you. That is not a one-time thing, that is a daily thing. Sometimes that's an hourly thing. God, I'm giving this situation, I'm giving this control back to you because I'm clearly not handling it well on my own, and I need you. Third, we need to learn to wait without spiraling. 37:7, be still in the presence of the Lord and wait patiently for him to act. Waiting does not mean doing nothing. It means not freaking out while you're doing the next right thing. And if we're honest, the next right thing might sometimes be the hardest thing. So at the end of the day, these two chapters remind us of something simple but grounding, encouraging. Evil is loud, but it's not permanent. It doesn't last. God is steady, God is consistent, God is faithful, and he's not going anywhere. So if it feels to you like life is upside down right now, you're actually in the very place that these two Psalms were written for. Maybe take some time, reread Psalm 37 slowly, sit with it, let it challenge you, because the goal isn't just to understand it, but to live it out in your life. And that's where things start to change for you and start to change for me. Won't he do it?